So a little bit about myself. I'm a developer since 2006. I'm self-employed as a dev consultant currently, and I didn't go to school. I'm self-employed, and I was also homeschooled. So newsflash, self-learning isn't new. But I wanted to share with you what I found out coming from an alternative education path. So we live in a world that is exponentially becoming more and more dynamic. Things are changing fast all the time. And I think you'll all agree with me that in today's world, the most important skill is the ability to adapt. And this is why self-learning is so important. It's the skill that's allowing you to acquire more skills. So I realized I can split my learning process into two concepts, learning by doing and learning by being. And they both complement each other. But before I'm going to dive into that, a word about mindset. So in order to learn something, you first need to believe that you are capable of doing so. You need to have something called a growth mindset. And I'm not going to go into much details about it, but basically it's a theory developed by Carol Dweck from Stanford. Basically, she categorized learners into two groups, fixed mindset and growth mindset. In short, those with a fixed mindset believe that their abilities are fixed and will avoid failures in a fear of losing their status. Those with a growth mindset believe that their abilities can be developed over time and anything can be learned if you just put effort to it. So this makes sense, but one more important thing is to not panic. In order to learn, you need to be able to not panic. And there are a few ways that can help you deal with panic. You can break it down, break your learning process down. Advance in, splits your learning into portions and advance on each one at a time. You can plan ahead, plan what you need to learn and what resources can help you learn that. You can research it. It's important to understand why you're learning what you're learning and the real-world application of it. So let's go into the first concept, learning by doing. So this is actually not a new idea. It's actually very ancient, and Aristo actually knew this before, centuries ago. He said, for the things we have to learn before we can do them, we learn by doing them. Simply put, it's knowledge acquired by doing is much more likely to stick. And so how can we apply this to our world? So you can use varied practice. For example, alternating between different projects or tasks during the day. Trying to recall where you left off actually makes you think harder and eventually remember more. This leads me to the next point, which is creating friction. Creating friction, when you when you create friction, you basically learn more, and because things that are hard to learn are much more likely to sink in. And this is why I call productivity learning's worst enemy, if you will, because the more you're trying to be efficient, the less friction you create, and the less you eventually learn. So try to avoid over-sophisticated IDEs or autocomplete, spell checker, all of those things are really, really good for productivity, but bad if you're trying to learn. The last point I wanted to mention is testing your knowledge. And basically, have you ever noticed what happens when you try to explain something to anyone else? right, you start to notice the loose ends you have in your theory. So the same thing happens when you try to explain to yourself. And you can use that while you're learning to make sure you really, really understand. So let's jump into the next concept, which is learning by being. So there's a famous quote of Albert Einstein, and he said, it's not that I'm so smart, it's just that I stay with problems longer. What does it mean to us? Well, I call it immersive learning. And maybe the best example of immersive learning is babies learn how to speak. Babies are constantly surrounded by voices and sound. And at first, they don't know, they can't make sense of the sound they hear. But they're really deeply immersed in the experience of listening. And eventually, they learn how to speak just by hanging around people who talk around them. So that's pretty amazing. And us developers already do something very similar, which is getting into the zone. And I think most of you know what I'm talking about, that hyper-focused state when you're the most productive. So it's a similar state, but instead of producing stuff, we're absorbing information. So how can we implement immersive learning? The best way that I found out to be the most effective is creating short immersive experiences, which is basically means deciding on times during the day that are solely dedicated for learning. And so this actually goes hand in hand with the friction concept I mentioned earlier. And to mention, another point I wanted to mention is the last point, incubation period, which refers to the concept of getting your mind, your conscious mind, out of the problem for a while and let the ideas surface up at a later time. This is actually the reason why we think about or come up with the best ideas at the weirdest places, like the shower or on the train on the way home. And I think I'm going to leave you with that. Thank you for listening, and enjoy the rest of the conference.